Joining us now here on News Talk on News Channel 8, Dan Verton. He's executive editor of Meritalk.com and a former intelligence officer. Good to have you with us again. Thanks so much for your time.
Sure.
When the news broke on Friday that there were large-scale, coordinated attacks against innocent civilians in Paris, and we learned in the it didn't take very long for, I think, the enormity, the magnitude of these attacks to become apparent. What thoughts did you have?
Well, immediately it harkened back to the attacks in Mumbai in India. This was something that was taken right out of the playbook from Mumbai, where you had a team of 10 attackers who fanned out across the city in a very well-coordinated, planned attack that took perhaps months to plan out in advance. They went and they held and attacked key positions throughout the city. They included both small arms attacks and also improvised explosive devices. And what you saw in Paris was exactly the same tactics and the same strategy played out throughout the streets of Paris. The terrorist organizations, ISIS and others, have figured out that that is the tactic that works today. Easy to get weapons, very, very easy to make TATP, triacetone triperoxide, improvised explosive devices. The components for that are easily available in any grocery store or hardware store, and devastating. So they understand that this is the way they can get around some of the security precautions we've put in place.
So much loss of innocent life, so much death, so many people severely injured. This has enormous impact for all of the people directly involved, but also for the general sense that people have that they can go where they want and do what they want with a high degree of confidence that nothing bad will happen. I mean, these were people out on a Friday night in one of the world's most cosmopolitan and presumably safe cities doing perfectly appropriate things, and they're gone.
Right. Well, there is something also to say about the situation in Europe. Europe has a very different problem than we have in the United States. They have a very large population, Muslim community that has not been integrated very well into European society. And what you actually have is what you're seeing now in terms of the investigation. Authorities are looking at these, what can only be described as Muslim ghettos surrounding the outskirts of Paris, particularly in other places like in Belgium, where you have large numbers of disaffected youth that are ripe recruiting grounds for radical Islamic clerics. And we've known this for the better part of a decade. We've actually had independent filmmakers document recruitment efforts by the Salafist Brigade in those very neighborhoods surrounding Paris and throughout Belgium.
In some cases with native-born
Absolutely,
young people.
Yes. So these are people who've only known life in Europe, but they are successfully radicalized in person. And then also we see with groups like ISIS just making incredible use of social media in a way that takes these folks who might be sitting on the fence in terms of supporting the ideology but not necessarily taking action, and it brings them across that line.
Do we have a flavor for what the ideology is? I mean, what are the motivating ideas that get these young people to commit acts of evil?
Well, you know, the interesting thing is that ISIS, as an example, is more of a death cult than it is a radical Islamic movement. Although they base a lot of their actions on a twisted interpretation of the Islamic religion, this group is bent on total destruction of just about everything and anything. And so these young kids are being radicalized because they are being told that they have no future in a Western society. They have no future other than following the interpretation presented to them by ISIS or other radical Islamic groups. So they are sitting ducks for these radical imams, and there are many of them. We know that, for example, more than 6,000 Europeans have gone to Syria to fight for ISIS. More than 1,000 have returned to Europe. We don't necessarily know who all those individuals are. We know that there are several hundred of those who have returned to the United States. And so there's a big question about, do we know who all these young, presumably radicalized individuals are that are in the United States?
We're always told that the lone wolf is the scariest potential assailant because there's no in part because there's no communication to intercept. Here we had a cabal, a group. We had multiple people, and presumably communication and coordination, but enough discipline or enough luck, or both, that communication was not intercepted in a way that could have led to the attacks being stopped.
So this was a series of attacks that was basically brainstormed in Syria. Logistics were done and coordination were done in Belgium, and it was carried out in France. The logistics were done in communities where the police, quite frankly, like we have in some places in the United States, don't go very often because they're too dangerous. And so they have basically an isolated community, an isolated area to do their planning. And so communications, I heard some talk early today about electronic communications, encrypted communications. They didn't even need to worry about that in this situation. These are devices that they could easily have obtained the materials for and made under the radar without having to worry about electronic communications.
I need to hit a break in a minute 15 or so. What do you think was the likely conversation as, coincidentally, the world leaders gathered at the G20?
Well, if you heard the president this morning, he got hammered on his so-called strategy. The press wasn't about to let it go in terms of his strategy of containment. And I think the discussion was, one, how did several dozen individuals remain under the radar when several of them had been picked up in the last 10 to 12 months, connected to radical Islamic plots? Why did that happen? Why were the dots not connected? Again, once we go back to 9/11, it's hindsight is 20/20, but nonetheless, these are lessons that we've learned many, many years ago that should have been implemented in this case, and they weren't.
We'll take a break here as we continue to talk with Dan Verton, executive editor of MeritTalk.com. A break here, back though with more News Talk here on News Channel 8 right after this.